Follow the news closely. Now, again, 2025 and this year has been rather bumpy when we look at the geopolitical change. Now, make no mistake, pay a closer attention to the Trump administration, especially when we're looking at the domestic and international affairs. Sitting Vice President J.D. Vance and took his power to the media. Now, recently, he wrote an opinion piece and posted on the Washington Post, and it's entitled, What President Trump Achieved in His First 100 Days. Now, in this piece, not only the Vice President J.D. Vance lay out the accomplishment that under President Trump, and also he concluded the piece by saying the Trump administration is keeping its promises. Is that really the case? When we look at the international affairs and the trade war, and particularly the war in Ukraine, how is President Trump keeping the promises? And remember that back in the days, that President Trump vowed to end the war in 24 hours. And also Trump vowed to invite Zelensky and Putin to sit at the same table to negotiate. Well, things are not that easy, isn't it? So that's why at this moment, when we are looking at the war in Ukraine, and we'll look at the relationship between Russia and Ukraine at this moment, what can we say about leadership? And what do we know about the future? What would happen if the US government decides to abandon Ukraine? Isn't that sad? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Dr. Alexander Motyl. Dr. Motyl is an American historian. He's a political scientist. He is a professor of political science at Rutgers University in New York and a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the Soviet Union. Well, Dr. Motyl, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you for having me, Will, and thank you to your audience for listening.
Well, Dr. Motyl, again, I have to admit that when I came across this opinion piece written by sitting Vice President J.D. Vance regarding President Trump's first 100 days, and especially how he highlighted that the Trump administration is keeping its promises, I want to get your reaction first when we talk about the war in Ukraine. You, as a historian, expert, how should we assess his foreign policy performance, especially in the war of Ukraine, within the first 100 days? Your thoughts?
Well, in general, when it comes to a general assessment of his foreign policy performance, I think the best word that describes it is disaster. Obviously, Trump disagrees. Obviously, Vance disagrees. But what Trump has managed to do in 100 days is to transform America from a country that promoted democracy, that was concerned with international rules, that was concerned with international law, even as it violated them. I don't want to idealize America, but it was a country that had a certain ethical and moral profile. It was a country that worked together with its allies. It was a country that tried to stabilize the world economically, politically, militarily. Again, with certain provisos, but nevertheless, Trump has managed to upend that image in 100 days. America is now perceived by most people in most countries of the world as a rogue state, unconcerned with anything but itself. It's willing to strong-arm its allies. It ignores the well-being of the population of the globe. It's unconcerned with the health of the globe. It seems to be concerned only with promoting Trump's ego. So on that score, Trump fails. He's managed to transform Canada, Greenland, Mexico, and of course Panama into ardent supporters of their own countries. I mean, the Canadians have always had a reputation as being nice, clean, polite, hard to ignite over some particular issue. I mean, they were considered to be, by Americans, as kind of the ultimate civilized nation. And now Canadians voted for the Liberal Party precisely because it opposed Donald Trump. Reacted in the manner of hardcore nationalists, which is completely atypical for Canadians. Greenland, which had aspirations for more autonomy and independence, has now asserted itself as well. None of this was necessary. The Europeans are upset. The Chinese are, of course, upset over the tariffs. The South Koreans, the Japanese are upset over what Trump's tariffs and his policies more generally are doing to their positions within the globe. So Trump has failed. When it comes to foreign policy, he's failed completely. When it comes to Ukraine, the picture is a bit mixed, a bit more mixed, but nevertheless not exactly too encouraging. As you said, Trump promised to end the war in 24 hours. In making that promise, Trump essentially said that the war is now his. In recent weeks, Trump administration officials have started calling the war Biden's war. Well, it was Biden's war until Trump said he would solve the problem in 24 hours. That made it Trump's war. That was a stupid move on his part. It was either exaggeration, as he claimed, or simply inability to understand the complexity of the war. And now that he seems to be understanding the complexity of the war and is now saying that, well, it might take 200 days, 100 days. More recently, Trump administration officials have even started saying there may be no immediate solution in sight. All of that just bespeaks his appreciation, perhaps, of the fact that 24 hours was completely unrealistic, indeed idiotic, and perhaps even 24 weeks or 24 months might be more realistic, a target date. At the same time, there is a noticeable change in rhetoric over the last week. Trump met with Zelensky in the Vatican. That was an important meeting, if only because of the symbolism, the two men hunched over talking to each other. Zelensky came away and said that the meeting was substantive. Following the meeting, Trump actually criticized Putin and Russia for being obstructionist. Other Trump administration officials have said something similar about Russia and Putin as well. And the Ukrainians have taken advantage of this situation to argue for a ceasefire, a 30-day ceasefire, as opposed to the ridiculous 3-day ceasefire proposed by Putin and his people. So there may be a shift in rhetoric. Now, it's hard to say whether this shift will be permanent, because with Trump, you never know. He can say one thing one moment and then contradict himself in 10 seconds. So we don't know whether this is a significant shift and whether it's a permanent shift, but it's certainly positive. It's certainly preferable to that which had been the case before. More substantive is that the United States has agreed to provide Ukraine with $50 million worth of assistance for repairing F-16 fighters. The Pentagon has just recently announced that it will provide $300 million worth of assistance. And just today I read that White House spokespeople have said that Israel will be sending a Patriot missile system to Ukraine. And another one, perhaps from Germany or Greece, will be sent to Ukraine as well. That's significant, because it obviously means that something is being done as opposed to something being said. And inasmuch as there was concern on the part of Ukraine as well as others that Trump might simply cut off all assistance altogether, the fact that they are now providing, or say that they will provide, something like $350 million worth of assistance plus these Patriot systems, this is serious. It's still far short of the 40 billion that Ukraine needs, but it's at least a step in the right direction, and it suggests that perhaps something has changed in Trump's thinking. But again, we won't know whether this is permanent or not, possibly ever, but certainly not for the next few weeks.
Well, again, Dr. Motyl, I agree with you 100%. As you mentioned before, given the fact that Trump is a unpredictable character, now let's talk about the political relationship between Trump and Putin. Now, there's no surprise that when we describe particularly this political career or this political ambition for Putin, we tend to characterize by two things. And number one, we know that Putin tend to resist foreign coercions. And also, he's not really appreciating what we called the domestic struggles. So in other words, he's trying to manipulate or trying to use his power to manipulate the power struggle domestically. Now, Dr. Motyl, from your perspective, we're looking at this unpredictable character of Donald Trump. And also, on the other hand, we're still looking at Putin, who resists the foreign coercion. How do you think that, based on Trump's reaction, took on social media very boldly, said, "Stop Vladimir"? I mean, again, we saw the message the first time, had the social media confrontation with the Russian leader. But what is the next between those two? So in other words, how much do we understand that Putin is going to, or it's willing to work with Trump in order to say, hey, de-escalate the tension between Russia and Ukraine at this moment? What do you say to that?
Well, look, first of all, let me make a comment about Trump's social media, the Truth Social statement. He said, "Vladimir, stop." Now, what's significant about this was that he said Vladimir. He addressed him in the informal manner of a friend speaking to a friend. Then he says, "Stop." Well, okay, so this is so typical of Trump's attitudes toward Putin. He makes a statement that sounds tough, stop, but then suggests that it's really just one friend talking to another, Vladimir. So again, it's an important statement by Trump, but it doesn't suggest that he's become hostile to Putin and treats him now as an adversary. He's still thinking of him as a friend with whom he's had good relations in the past. The problem for Trump is that Putin is essentially taking advantage of his benevolence. Putin, remember, is a former KGB officer. This is a man who was trained to detest everything related to democracy and the market. This was a man who was trained in the ideology of the Soviet Union. This is a man who, as a KGB officer, understands the importance of manipulation and understands the importance of violence and coercion. And the approach that Trump has adopted to deal with Putin is exactly the wrong one. He's trying to soften him. He's providing him with carrots. So he said that Ukraine won't join NATO. One doesn't say those sorts of things, even if it's true. You save that for the negotiation, and you exact some kind of return for that concession. He refused to condemn the war at a number of occasions. One was at the United Nations Security Council, and then a meeting of the G7. Again, you don't do that. You extract compromises in order to make those sorts of moves. So essentially, his approach to Putin has been all carrots, no sticks. And the signal that sends to Putin is that Trump is weak, he's confused, and doesn't really know how to deal with him. Putin, unfortunately, understands only the language of coercion and violence. Again, this is true for him as a former KGB officer. This is true of his last 25 years, when he's assassinated something like 20 to 30 political opponents, started wars in a number of places, most recently in Ukraine. He understands the language of violence. He understands the language of coercion. And the approach that Trump should have adopted to Putin, and perhaps is finally beginning to adopt in the last few weeks, is to compel Putin to the negotiating table. Putin will never go on his own voluntarily, because that would imply that he is weak, and that would imply that he is willing to abandon the 4 provinces that Russia has annexed. He simply can't do that, and he won't do that as long as he remains in power. He can only do that if he is forced to do that. Forcing him to do that would be 2 things, or one of 2 things. One is to provide Ukraine with continued military assistance, and not just continued assistance, but with greater assistance. And as I mentioned in my first comment, there is some evidence to suggest that Trump understands that. And the other point, the other strategy that needs to be adopted is economic. And as you know, the Republican Senator Lindsey Graham has initiated a law, a projected law, which has the support of 72 senators, which would impose extremely high tariffs to the order of 500% on countries that deal in the secondary market with Russian energy sources. This would have a potentially devastating effect on the Russian economy. And that, together with continued assistance to Ukraine, has the chance of persuading Putin that this war has to end in some fashion or other. If nothing else, it would persuade members of the Russian political elite and economic elite that the war is beginning to destroy them, not just the million soldiers who've lost their lives or their legs, but is actually beginning to destroy them. So thus far, as I said, Trump has not pursued this strategy, which is the only one that works. And as we can see, his strategy of carrots definitely does not work. And it may be the case that he's changing his mind. But as I said before, it's still a little too early to tell for sure.
Well, Dr. Motyl, I know you're very busy. I got 2 more questions before letting you go. Now, let's bring in China into our conversation. When we look at the war in Ukraine, of course, that we have to talk about this economic aspect from the Chinese perspective, and also given the fact that the trade war between US and China on the daily basis, it's actually escalating. Now, I just carefully use the words to describe Putin. And I think it's the same thing that, if I may, to describe the Chinese leaders today. Again, based on the report that the Chinese government does not like foreign coercion either, and also Chinese leaders are having a difficulty to managing the domestic affairs and also try to handle this power struggle within the party as well. So Dr. Motyl, from your perspective, what role do we see China play at this moment? On one hand is the trade war with the US, but on the other hand, China still have this economic relationship with Russia, with Ukraine. So in other words, does China still have anything to bargain with the US and in order to get a better deal out of the trade war, or even perhaps can contribute to the US able to help with the war in Ukraine? What do you say to that?
Well, as you know, something like 150 Chinese soldiers are active in Ukraine. In Ukraine, not in Russia, but in Ukraine. 2 or 3 of them were captured. One of them testified to Ukrainian authorities about the dismal condition of the Russian armed forces. They claim to be private mercenaries. It's hard to imagine in a society that is as closed as China that one can simply voluntarily board a plane to Moscow and volunteer for the Russian armed forces. So I've heard and read alternative interpretations saying that these are probably Chinese special forces who were sent in order to acquire experience in drone warfare. Whatever the case, this obviously signals a greater involvement on the part of China in the war. Will it lead to Chinese pressure on Russia to settle? That's an interesting question. It should, because it's in China's interest that Russia remain a more or less stable, more or less reliable partner. I think I think we've discussed this point before. I mean, China wants a weaker partner, a partner that is more amenable to Chinese pressure, but at the same time, it doesn't want Russia to lose the war, to be devastated and destroyed in the process. So it certainly has an interest in promoting some kind of peace. As you recall, a few years ago, the Chinese did propose a peace plan. Well, that was just basically empty words. But nevertheless, it's suggested that China understands that it has a potential role to play. As to the United States, the tariffs that Trump has imposed on China, something like 150%, and probably more is yet to come, is essentially another one of these instances of Trump's inclination towards self-destruction. China and the United States are now involved in a so-called game of chicken, where they're both driving at each other at rapid speeds. And now the question is who is going to swerve and who is basically going to give up first. I think China will win. For one thing, when you consider the composition of the population, the United States, Americans don't have patience. They want immediate results. They're not used to hardships, certainly not recently. And once the prices of household goods will rise from $10 to $25, once the prices on clothing, I would say, just about everything in my kitchen and a good part of the stuff in my wardrobe is made in China. And I bought it because it's generally good quality and the prices are very attractive. Now, instead of paying $100 for a jacket, I'll have to pay $250. And I'm not going to do that. And the Americans, so in other words, compared to the Chinese population, which has a thousands-year-old culture, which thinks in very different categories, time moves much more slowly in China than it does in the United States. The Chinese population has been used to and has experienced enormous hardships over the last 50, 60 years. The world wars, the imperialist aggressions, Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, the Chinese Cultural Revolution. The Chinese are people who are they have far more patience and far more willingness to endure hardships. So my own sense is China will win this particular contest, the United States will lose, and Trump will be humiliated in the process. Naturally, he's not going to admit that. He's going to say that he won, but everybody will know that it's been a loss. There was a moment, I believe, in the 1960s when an American journalist asked Zhou Enlai, Mao Zedong's right-hand man, what he thought of the impact of the consequences of the French Revolution, which happened in 1789. Zhou Enlai responded, "It's too soon to tell." And that, I think, nicely captures the sense of time that many Chinese have. In the American case, we want results immediately, and we want the best possible results even sooner than that. And that's just not going to happen.
Dr. Motyl, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. If I may to borrow a sentence from the former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, he once said, and I quote, "America always know how to do the best thing or to make the smartest choice after exhausting all the possibilities," end quote. I mean, again, when we're looking at the situation under Donald Trump and look at the war in Ukraine, of course, the conflict in the Middle East as well, it's rather alarming to see the decisions that made under the Trump administration, despite the opinion piece wrote by the sitting Vice President J.D. Vance. Now, when we look at Russia, we look at China, some experts believe that it's time that for U.S. to delegate those tasks with China, with Russia, and also many other countries instead of using coercion, but why not try a diplomatic approach? For example, China has sought to blunt Western protectionism by deepening regional ties. It has accelerated negotiation on the free trade agreement with the Arab states of the Gulf Cooperation Council, etc. So, Dr. Motyl, from your perspective, you're an expert, you're a historian. So, the last question I want to ask is it still workable when we look at China, when we look at Russia, or look at any other countries that use diplomatic approach instead of using fear, instead of using coercion? And do you think this could be a new strategy for Trump in order to, I would say, to win the point, or even to say to look good on the surface level? Your final thoughts.
I completely agree with the thrust of your question. I mean, it makes much more sense to try to solve problems diplomatically than militarily. Now, that's not always possible, but the military should be one's last resort rather than one's first resort. That goes without saying, and it's always been true in world history. It's much cheaper, it's much more humane to try to figure out compromise solutions based on diplomatic negotiations. So I think in that particular regard, the Chinese are acting very responsibly. They see a problem. Now, again, the Chinese are also people who use muscle, who use weapons, who use ships in their claims to the South China Sea. And there is, of course, the potential of an aggression vis-a-vis Taiwan. But that said, the Chinese appreciate the importance of negotiations and trade pacts. And one of their responses, as you said, to Trump's tariffs has been to try to expand their network of economic relationships in Asia, as well as in Europe, which is the smart thing to do. What Trump has done is he's pretty much excluded negotiation from the agenda of American tools, foreign policy tools, and that essentially leaves him with only one option, and that is force with coercion and violence. And this from a man who doesn't want to get involved in global affairs. This from a man who says that he's putting America first. Well, he may be placing America first, but in so doing, he's placing American lives in the first battlegrounds, future battlegrounds in the world. So it's just another instance of his disastrous foreign policy. He should be pursuing more diplomacy, should be pursuing more good relations. He should repair the relations with the Europeans, with the Canadians, with the Panamanians. He should work, his attitude towards them should be precisely what his attitude towards Putin has been, and his attitude towards Putin should be precisely what it has been. So he's gotten it all completely wrong. Can he change, as you asked? Can he suddenly see the light? I mean, in principle, everybody can. And there have been many instances in the past where leaders have changed their positions on particular issues overnight. So it's not inconceivable that Trump might be able to do this. The problem is that this kind of impetuosity, this kind of tough talk, is part of his genetic makeup. It's his character. This is who he is. He talks loudly and carries a small stick, so to speak, to paraphrase Theodore Roosevelt. This is his modus operandi, and I don't think he can easily change that, especially not at his age. He's 78 or something, or thereabouts. You know, at that point, when you get into your 70s, you pretty much are fixed in your personality and character. You know the saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. So I'm somewhat skeptical about his ability to shift, but it's conceivable. You know, if the disastrous impact that I project for the tariffs and for his relations with the rest of the world comes to pass, he may simply have no choice but to shift grounds and to shift tactics if he wants to remain president, if he wants to prevent some kind of Republican or more general insurrection against him. And then perhaps his sense of security, his sense of self, will overcome his desire to be a bull in a china shop. And perhaps that part of him will get the upper hand and we'll see a new Trump. But as you can see from my comments, I'm somewhat skeptical, but hopeful. So we'll see.
Well, again, Dr. Motyl, that's such a good attitude. And again, I would say, regardless of the war in Ukraine and also this unpredictability of Donald Trump, it's worth to be skeptical, but also it's more important to be positive. And we know that it's difficult to see Donald Trump change, but that is not impossible. But again, it takes steps. And hopefully next time that when we see a opinion piece written by J.D. Vance, it's not just about Trump keeps the promises. It's really about Trump needs to put the actions behind the words. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Dr. Alexander Motyl. Again, Dr. Motyl, it's an American historian. He's a political scientist, and he's a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the Soviet Union. Well, Dr. Motyl, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We'd love to have you back on the show for our future episodes. But meanwhile, let's keep on watching the Trump administration and also the progress in the war of Ukraine. So thank you so much for doing this.